CHAPTER IX. Part III of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. CHAPTER IX. Part III. Madame Dubreuil led Clara to the house, while the Goualeuse remained in the midst of the hostile circle which had now formed around her. Spite of the reproaches of Madame Dubreuil, her presence and that of Clara had, in some degree, served to allay the fears of Fleur de Marie as to the probable termination of the scene. But after the departure of both mother and daughter, when she found herself so entirely at the mercy of the enraged crowd, her strength seemed to forsake her, and she was obliged to keep herself from falling by leaning on the parapet of the deep watering place where the farm cattle were accustomed to drink. Nothing could be conceived more touching than the attitude of the unfortunate girl, nor could a more threatening appearance have been displayed than was exhibited in the words and looks of the countrymen and women who surrounded her. Seated, or rather supporting herself on the narrow margin of the wall which enclosed the drinking place, her head hanging down, and concealed by both hands, her neck and bosom hid by the ends of the little red cotton handkerchief which was twisted around her cap, the poor Goualeuse, mute and motionless, presented a most touching picture of grief and resignation. At some little distance from Fleur de Marie stood the widow of the murdered man. Triumphant in her vindictive rage, and still further excited by the indignation expressed by Madame Dubreuil, she pointed out the wretched object of her wrath to the labourers and her children, with gestures of contempt and detestation. The farm servants, who had now formed into a close circle, sought not to conceal their disgust and thirst for vengeance. Their rude countenances expressed at once rage, desire for revenge, and a sort of insulting raillery. The women were even still more bitter, and bent upon mischief. Neither did the striking beauty of the Goualeuse tend to allay their wrath; but neither men nor women could pardon Fleur de Marie the heinous offence of having, up to that hour, been treated by their superiors as an equal; and some of the men now present, having been unsuccessful candidates for the vacant situations at Bouqueval, and attributing their failure to Madame Georges, when in reality their disappointment arose entirely from their recommendations not being sufficiently satisfactory, determined to avail themselves of the opportunity now before them to wreak their vexation and ill will on the head of one she was known to protect and love. The impulses of ignorant minds always lead to extremes, either of good or bad; but they speedily put on a most dangerous form, when the fury of an enraged multitude is directed against those who may already have awakened their personal anger or aversion. Although the greater number of the labourers now collected together might not have been so strictly virtuous and free from moral blame as to be justified in throwing the first stone at the trembling, fainting girl, who was the object of all their concentrated wrath, yet, on the present occasion, they unanimously spoke and acted as though her very presence was capable of contaminating them, and their delicacy and modesty alike revolted at the bare recollection of the depraved class to which she had belonged, and they shuddered to be so near one who confessed to having frequently conversed with assassins. Nothing, then, was wanting to urge on a blind and prejudiced crowd, still further instigated by the example of Madame Dubreuil. "Take her before the mayor!" cried one. "Ay, ay! And if she won't walk, we'll drag her." "And for her to have the impudence to dress herself like one of us honest girls!" said an awkward, ill looking farm wench. "I'm sure," rejoined another female, with her mock modest air, "one might have thought she would go to heaven, spite of priest or confession. Why, she had the assurance even to attend mass." "No, did she? Why did she not join in the communion afterwards, then, I should like to know? And then she must play the young lady, and hold up her head as high as our betters. As though we were not good company enough for her! However, every dog has his day." "Oh, I'll make you find your tongue, and tell who it was took my husband's life!" vociferated the enraged widow, breaking out into a fresh storm, now she felt her party so strong. "You all belong to one gang, and I'm not sure but I saw you among them at the very time and place when the bloody deed was done. Come, come, don't stand there shedding your crocodile tears. You are found out, and may as well leave off shamming any more. Show your face, I say. You are a beauty, ain't you?" And the infuriated woman, suiting the action to the word, violently snatched the two hands of poor Fleur de Marie from the pale and grief worn countenance they concealed, and down which tears were fast streaming. The Goualeuse, sinking under a sense of shame, and terrified at finding herself thus at the mercy of her persecutors, joined her hands, and turning towards the milk woman her supplicating and timid looks, she said, in a gentle voice: "Indeed, madame, I have been at the farm of Bouqueval these last 2 months. How could I, then, have been witness to the dreadful misfortune you speak of? And " The faint tones of Fleur de Marie's voice were drowned in the loud uproarious cries of the surrounding multitude. "Let us take her before the mayor; she can speak, and she shall, too, to some purpose. March, march, my fine madam, on with you!" So saying, the menacing crowd pressed upon the poor girl, who mechanically crossed her hands on her bosom, looked eagerly around, as though in search of help. "Oh," cried the milk woman, "you need not stare about in that wild way. Mlle. Clara is not here now to take your part. You don't slip through my fingers, I promise you." "Alas, madame," uttered Fleur de Marie, trembling violently, "I seek not to escape from you. Be assured I am both ready and willing to answer all the questions put to me, if I can be of any service to you by so doing. But what harm have I done to these people, who surround and threaten me in this manner?"
"What have you done?" repeated a number of voices. "Why, you have dared to stick yourself up with our betters, when we, who were worth thousands more than such as you, were made to keep our distance, that's what you have done." "And what right had you to cause this poor woman to be turned away with her fatherless children?" cried another.
"Indeed, it was no fault of mine; it was Mlle. Clara who wished "
"That is not true," interrupted the speaker. "You never even opened your mouth in her favour. No, not you. You were too well pleased to see her bread taken from her." "No, no more she did," chimed in the burst of voices, male and female. "She is a regular bad one. A poor widow woman with 3 helpless children."
"If I did not plead for her with Mlle. Clara, it was because I had not power to utter a word."
"You could find strength enough to talk to a set of thieves and murderers."
And, as is frequently the case in public commotions, the country people, more ignorant than vicious, actually talked themselves into a fury, until their own words and violence excited them to fresh acts of rage and vengeance against their unhappy victim. The menacing throng, gesticulating and loudly threatening, advanced closer and closer towards Fleur de Marie, while the widow appeared to have lost all command of herself. Separated from the deep pond only by the parapet on which she was leaning, the Goualeuse shuddered at the idea of their throwing her into the water, and, extending towards them her supplicating hands, she exclaimed: "Good, kind people, what do you want with me? For pity's sake, do not harm me!" And as the milk woman, with fierce and angry gestures, kept coming nearer and nearer, holding her clenched fist almost in the face of Fleur de Marie, the poor girl, drawing herself back in terror, said in beseeching tones: "Pray, do not press so closely on me, or you will cause me to fall into the water." These words suggested a cruel idea to the rough spectators. Intending merely one of those practical jokes which, however diverting to the projectors, are fraught with serious harm and suffering to the unfortunate object of them, one of the most violent of the number called out: "Let's give her a plunge in! Duck her! Duck her!" "Yes, yes!" chimed several voices, accompanied with brutal laughter, and noisy clapping of hands, with other tokens of unanimous approval. "Throw her in! In with her!" "A good dip will do her good. Water won't kill her. That will teach her not to show her face among honest people again. To be sure! Toss her in! Fling her over! Fortunately, the ice was broken this morning; and, when she has had her bath, she may go and tell her street companions how the folks at Arnouville farm serve such vile girls as she is." As these unfeeling speeches reached her ear, as she heard their barbarous jokes, and observed the exasperated looks of the brutally excited individuals who approached her to carry their threat into execution, Fleur de Marie gave herself over for lost. But to her first horror of a violent death succeeded a sort of gloomy satisfaction. The future wore so threatening and hopeless an aspect for her that she thanked Heaven for shortening her trial. Not another complaining word escaped her; but gently falling on her knees, and piously folding her hands upon her breast, she closed her eyes, and meekly resigned herself to her fate. The labourers, surprised at the attitude and mute resignation of the Goualeuse, hesitated a moment in the accomplishment of their savage design; but, rallied on their folly and irresolution by the female part of the assemblage, they recommenced their uproarious cries, as though to inspire themselves with the necessary courage to complete their wicked purpose. Just as two of the most furious of the party were about to seize on Fleur de Marie, a loud, thrilling voice was heard exclaiming, "Stop! I command you!" And at the very instant Madame Georges, who had forced a passage through the crowd, reached the still kneeling Goualeuse, took her in her arms, and, raising her, cried: "Rise up, my child! Stand up, my beloved daughter! The knee should be bent to God alone." The expression and attitude of Madame Georges were so full of courageous firmness that the actors in this cruel scene shrunk back speechless and confounded. Indignation coloured her usually pale features, and casting on the labourers a stern look, she said to them, in a loud and threatening voice: "Wretches! Are you not ashamed of such brutal conduct to a helpless girl like this? She is my daughter!" exclaimed Madame Georges, with severity, and abruptly interrupting the man who was about to speak, "and, as such, both cherished and protected by our worthy curé, M. l'Abbé Laporte, whom every one venerates and loves; and those whom he loves and esteems ought to be respected by every one." These simple words effectually imposed silence on the crowd. The curé of Bouqueval was looked upon throughout his district almost as a saint, and many there present were well aware of the interest he took in the Goualeuse. Still a confused murmur went on, and Madame Georges, fully comprehending its import, added: "Suppose this poor girl were the very worst of creatures, the most abandoned of her sex, your conduct is not the less disgraceful. What offence has she committed? And what right have you to punish her? You who call yourselves men, to exert your strength and power against one poor, feeble, unresisting female! Surely it was a cowardly action all to unite against a defenceless girl? Come, Marie, come, child of my heart, let us return home; there, at least, you are known, and justly appreciated." Madame Georges took the arm of Fleur de Marie, while the labourers, ashamed of their conduct, the impropriety of which they now perceived, respectfully dispersed. The widow alone remained; and, advancing boldly to Madame Georges, she said, in a resolute tone: "I don't care for a word you say, and as for this girl, she does not quit this place until after she has deposed before the mayor as to all she knows of my poor husband's murder." "My good woman," said Madame Georges, restraining herself by a violent effort, "my daughter has no deposition to make here, but at any future period that justice may require her testimony let her be summoned, and she shall attend with myself; until then no person has a right to question her." "But, madame, I say " Madame Georges prevented the milkwoman from proceeding by replying, in a severe tone: "The severe affliction you have experienced can scarcely excuse your conduct, and you will one day regret the violence you have so improperly excited. Mademoiselle Marie lives with me at the Bouqueval farm. Inform the judge who received your deposition of that circumstance, and say that we await his further orders." The widow, unable to argue against words so temperately and wisely spoken, seated herself on the parapet of the drinking place, and, embracing her children, began to weep bitterly. Almost immediately after this scene Pierre brought the chaise, into which Madame Georges and Fleur de Marie mounted, to return to Bouqueval. As they passed before the farmhouse of Arnouville, the Goualeuse perceived Clara, who had hid herself behind a partly closed shutter, weeping bitterly. She was evidently watching for a last glimpse of her friend, to whom she waved her handkerchief in token of farewell. "Oh, madame, what shame to me, and vexation to you, has arisen this morning from our visit to Arnouville!" said Fleur de Marie to her adopted parent, when they found themselves in the sitting room at Bouqueval. "You have probably quarrelled for ever with Madame Dubreuil, and all on my account. Oh, I foresaw something terrible was about to happen. God has justly punished me for deceiving that good lady and her daughter. I am the unfortunate cause of perpetual disunion between yourself and your friend. My dear child, my friend is a warm hearted, excellent woman, but rather weak; still I know her too well not to feel certain that by to morrow she will regret her foolish violence of to day. Alas, madame, think not that I wish to take her part in preference to yours. No, God forbid! But pardon me if I say that I fear your great kindness towards me has induced you to shut your eyes to Put yourself in the place of Madame Dubreuil, to be told that the companion of your darling daughter was what I was. Ah, could any one blame such natural indignation?"
Unfortunately, Madame Georges could not find any satisfactory reply to this question of Fleur de Marie's, who continued with much excitement:
"Soon will the degrading scene of yesterday be in everybody's mouth. I fear not for myself, but who can tell how far it may affect the reputation of Mlle. Clara? Who can answer for it that I may not have tarnished her fair fame for ever? For she did not, in the face of the assembled crowd, persist in calling me her friend, her sister. I ought to have obeyed my first impulse, and resisted the affection which attracted me towards Mlle. Dubreuil, and, at the risk of incurring her dislike, have refused the friendship she offered me. But I forgot the distance which separated me from her, and now, as you perceive, I am suffering the just penalty. I am punished, oh, how cruelly punished! For I have perhaps done an irreparable injury to one so virtuous and so good."
"My child," said Madame Georges, after a brief silence, "you are wrong to accuse yourself so cruelly. 'Tis true your past life has been guilty, very highly so; but are we to reckon as nothing your having, by the sincerity of your repentance, obtained the protection and favour of our excellent curé? And was it not under his auspices and mine you were introduced to Madame Dubreuil? And did not your own amiable qualities inspire her with the attachment she so voluntarily professed for you? Was it not she herself who requested you to call Clara your sister? And finally, as I told her just now, for I neither wished nor ought to conceal the whole truth from her, how could I, certain as I felt for your sincere repentance, how could I, divulging the past, render your attempts to reinstate yourself more painful and difficult, perhaps impossible, by throwing you, in despair of being again received by the good and virtuous, back upon the scorn and derision of those who, equally guilty, equally unfortunate as you have been, would not perhaps like you have preserved the secret instinct of honour and virtue? The disclosure made by the woman to day is alike to be lamented and feared; but could I, in anticipation of an almost impossible casualty, sacrifice your present comfort and future repose? Ah, madame, a convincing proof of the false and miserable position I must ever hold may be found in the fact of your being obliged to conceal the past, and that the mother of Clara despises me for that past, views me in the same contemptuous light all will henceforward behold me, for the scene at the farm of Arnouville will be quickly spread abroad. Every one will hear of it. Oh, I shall die with shame! Never again can I meet the looks of any human being." "Not even mine, my child?" said Madame Georges, bursting into tears, and opening her arms to Fleur de Marie. "You will never find in my heart any other feeling than the devoted tenderness of a mother. Courage, then, dear Marie! Console yourself with the knowledge of your hearty and sincere repentance. You are here surrounded with true and affectionate friends, let this home be your world. We will anticipate the exposure you dread so much. Our worthy abbé shall assemble the people about the farm, who all regard you with love and respect, and he shall tell them the sad history of your past life. And trust me, my child, told as the tale would be by him, whose word is law here, such a disclosure will but serve to increase the interest all take in your welfare." "I would fain think so, dear madame, and I submit myself. Yesterday, when we were conversing together, M. le Curé predicted to me that I should be called upon painfully to expiate my past offences. I ought not, therefore, to be astonished at their commencement. He told me also that my earthly trials would be accepted as some atonement for the great wrong I have done. I would fain hope so. Supported through these painful ordeals by you and my venerable pastor, I ought not to complain." "You will go to his presence ere long, and never will his counsels have been more valuable to you. It is already 4:30. Prepare yourself for your visit to the rectory, my child. I shall employ myself in writing to M. Rodolph an account of what occurred in the farm at Arnouville, and send my letter off by express. I will then join you at our venerable abbé's, for it is most important we should talk over matters together." Shortly after the Goualeuse quitted the farm in order to repair to the rectory by the hollow road, where the old woman, the Schoolmaster, and Tortillard had agreed to meet. As may have been perceived in her conversations with Madame Georges and the Curé of Bouqueval,
Fleur de Marie had so nobly profited by the example of her benefactors, so assimilated herself with their principles, that, remembering her past degradation, she daily became more hopeless of recovering the place she had lost in society. As her mind expanded, so did her fine and noble instincts arrive at mature growth, and bring forth worthy fruits in the midst of the atmosphere of honour and purity in which she lived. Had she possessed a less exalted mind, a less exquisite sensibility, or an imagination of weaker quality, Fleur de Marie might easily have been comforted and consoled. But, unfortunately, not a single day passed in which she did not recall, and almost live over again, with an agony of horror and disgust, the disgraceful miseries of her past life. Let the reader figure to himself a young creature of 16, candid and pure, and rejoicing in that very candour and purity, thrown, by frightful circumstances, into the infamous den of the ogress, and irrecoverably subjected to the dominion of such a fiend. Such was the reaction of the past on the present on Fleur de Marie's mind. Let us still further display the resentful retrospect, or, rather, the moral agony with which the Goualeuse suffered so excruciatingly, by saying that she regretted, more frequently than she had courage to own to the curé, the not having perished in the midst of the slough of wickedness by which she was encompassed. However little a person may reflect, or however limited his knowledge of life may be, he will not refuse to assent to our remarks touching the commiseration with such a case as Fleur de Marie's fully called for. She was deserving of both interest and pity, not only because she had never known what it was to have her affections fairly roused, but because all her senses were torpid, and as yet unawakened by noble impulses, untaught, unaided, unadvised. Is it not wonderful that this unfortunate girl, thrown at the tender age of 16 years in the midst of the herd of savage and demoralised beings who infest the Cité, should have viewed her degrading position with horror and disgust, and have escaped from the sink of iniquity morally pure and free from sin? Chapter 9, Part 3. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 10 of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Chapter 10. The Hollow Way. The sun was descending, and the fields were silent and deserted. Fleur de Marie had reached the entrance to the hollow way, which it was necessary to cross in her walk to the rectory, when she saw a little lame lad, dressed in a gray blouse and blue cap, come out of the ravine. He appeared in tears, and directly he saw the Goualeuse he ran towards her. "Oh, good lady, have pity on me, I pray!" he exclaimed, clasping his hands with a supplicating look. "What do you want? What is the matter with you, my poor boy?" said the Goualeuse, with an air of interest. "Alas, good lady, my poor grandmother, who is very, very old, has fallen down in trying to climb up the ravine, and hurt herself very much. I am afraid she has broken her leg, and I am too weak to lift her up myself. Mon Dieu! What shall I do if you will not come and help me? Perhaps my poor grandmother will die." The Goualeuse, touched with the grief of the little cripple, replied: "I am not very strong myself, my child, but perhaps I can help you to assist your poor grandmother. Let us go to her as quickly as we can. I live at the farm close by here, and if the poor old woman cannot walk there with us, I will send somebody to help her. Oh, good lady, le bon Dieu will bless you for your kindness. It is close by here, not 2 steps down this hollow way, as I told you. It was in going down the slope that she fell." "You do not belong to this part of the country?" said the Goualeuse, inquiringly, following Tortillard, whom our readers have, no doubt, recognised. "No, good lady, we come from Ecouen." "And where are you going?" "To a good clergyman's who lives on the hill out there," said Bras Rouge's son, to increase Fleur de Marie's confidence. "To the Abbé Laporte's, perhaps?" "Yes, good lady, to the Abbé Laporte's. My poor grandmother knows him very, very well." "And I was going there also. How strange that we should meet!" said Fleur de Marie, advancing still farther into the hollow way. "Grandmamma, I'm coming! Take courage, and I will bring you help!" cried Tortillard, to forewarn the Schoolmaster and the Chouette to prepare themselves to lay hands on their victim. "Your grandmother, then, did not fall down far from here?" inquired the Goualeuse. "No, good lady, behind that large tree there, where the road turns, about 20 paces from here." Suddenly Tortillard stopped. The noise of a horse galloping was heard in the silence of the place. "All is lost again!" said Tortillard to himself. The road made a very sudden bend a few yards from the spot where Bras Rouge's son was with the Goualeuse. A horseman appeared at the angle, and when he came nigh to the young girl he stopped. And then was heard the trot of another horse, and some moments after there followed a groom in a brown coat with silver buttons, white leather breeches, and top boots. A leathern belt secured around his waist his master's mackintosh. His master was dressed simply in a stout brown frock coat, and a pair of light gray trousers, which fitted closely. He was mounted on a thoroughbred and splendid bay horse, which he sat admirably, and which, in spite of the fast gallop, had not a bead of sweat on his skin, which was as bright and brilliant as a star. The groom's gray horse, which stood motionless a few paces behind his master, was also well bred and perfect of his kind. In the handsome dark face of the gentleman Tortillard recognised the Vicomte de Saint Remy, who was supposed to be the lover of the Duchesse de Lucenay. "My pretty lass," said the viscount to the Goualeuse, whose lovely countenance struck him, "would you be so obliging as to tell me the way to the village of Arnouville?" Fleur de Marie's eyes sunk before the bold and admiring look of the young man, as she replied: "On leaving the sunken road, sir, you must take the first turning to the right, and that path will lead you to an avenue of cherry trees, which is the straight road to Arnouville." "A thousand thanks, my pretty lass. You tell me better than an old woman whom I found a few yards further on stretched under a tree, for I could only get groans and moans out of her." "My poor grandmother!" said Tortillard, in a whining tone. "One word more," said M. de Saint Remy, addressing La Goualeuse. "Can you tell me if I shall easily find M. Dubreuil's farm at Arnouville?" Goualeuse could not prevent a shudder at these words, which recalled to her the painful scene of the morning. She replied: "The farm buildings border the avenue which you must enter to reach Arnouville, sir." "Once more many thanks, my pretty dear," said M. de Saint Remy, and he galloped off with his groom. The handsome features of the viscount were in full animation whilst he was talking to Fleur de Marie, but when he was again alone they became darkened and contracted by painful uneasiness. Fleur de Marie, remembering the unknown person for whom they were so hastily preparing a pavilion at the farm of Arnouville by Madame de Lucenay's orders, felt convinced it was for this young and good looking cavalier. The sound of the horses' feet as they galloped on was heard for some time on the hard and frozen ground, and by degrees grew fainter, then were no longer heard, and all was once more hushed in silence. Tortillard breathed again. Desirous of encouraging and warning his accomplices, one of whom, the Schoolmaster, was concealed from the horseman, Bras Rouge's son called out: "Granny, granny, here I am, with the good lady who is coming to help you." "Quick, quick, my boy! The gentleman on horseback has made us lose some time," said the Goualeuse, walking at a quicker pace, that she might reach the turning into the Holloway. She had scarcely entered it when the Chouette, who was hidden there, exclaimed: "Now, then, fourline!" Then, springing upon the Goualeuse, the one-eyed hag seized her by the neck with one hand, whilst with the other she pressed her mouth; and Tortillard, throwing himself at the young girl's feet, clung round her legs that she might not be able to stir. This took place so rapidly that the Chouette had no time to examine the Goualeuse's features; but, during the few instants it required for the Schoolmaster to quit the hole in which he was ensconced, to grope his way along with his cloak, the belle dame recognised her old victim. "La Pegriotte!" she exclaimed, in great surprise; then adding with savage delight, "What, is it you? And the baker, the devil, sends you! It is your fate, then, to fall into my clutches. I have my vitriol in the fiacre now, and your white skin shall have a touch, miss, for it makes me sick to see your fine lady countenance. Come, my man, mind she don't bite, and hold her tight whilst we bundle her up." The Schoolmaster seized the Goualeuse with his two powerful hands, and before she could utter a cry the Chouette threw the cloak over her head, and wrapped her up in it, tightly and securely. In a moment, Fleur de Marie, tied and enveloped, was without any power to move or call for assistance. "Now take up your parcel, fourline," said the Chouette. "He, he, he! This is not such a load as the Black Peter of the woman who was drowned in the canal of St. Martin, is it, my man?" And as the brigand shuddered at these words, which reminded him of his fearful vision, the one-eyed hag resumed: "Well, well, what ails you, fourline? Why, you seem frozen. Ever since the morning your teeth chatter as if you had the ague, and you look in the air as if you were looking for something there." "Vile impostor! He is looking to see the flies," said Tortillard. "Come, quick! Haste forward, my man! Up with Pegriotte! That's it!" said the Chouette, as she saw the ruffian lift Fleur de Marie in his arms as if he would carry a sleeping infant. "Quick to the coach! Quick, quick!" "But who will lead me?" inquired the Schoolmaster in a hoarse voice, and securing his light and flexible burden in his herculean arms. "Old wise head! He thinks of everything," said the Chouette. Then, lifting aside her shawl, she unfastened a red pocket handkerchief which covered her skinny neck, and, twisting it into its length, said to the Schoolmaster: "Open your ivories, and take the end of this wipe between them. Hold tight. Tortillard will take the other end in his hand, and you have nothing to do but to follow him. The good blind man requires a good dog. Here, brat!" The cripple cut a caper, and made a sort of low and odd barking. Then, taking the other end of the handkerchief in his hand, he led the Schoolmaster in this way, whilst the Chouette hastened forward to apprise Barbillon. We have not attempted to paint Fleur de Marie's terror when she found herself in the power of the Chouette and the Schoolmaster. She felt all her strength leave her, and could not offer the slightest resistance. Some minutes afterwards the Goualeuse was lifted into the fiacre which Barbillon drove, and although it was night they closed the window blinds carefully; and the three accomplices went, with their most expiring victim, towards the plain of St. Denis, where Thomas Seyton awaited them. CHAPTer 10. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 11, Part 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Chapter 11, Part 1. Clémence d'Harville. The reader will kindly excuse our having left one of our heroines in a most critical situation, the dénouement of which we shall state hereafter. It will be remembered that Rodolph had preserved Madame d'Harville from an imminent danger, occasioned by the jealousy of Sarah, who had acquainted M. d'Harville with the assignation Clémence had so imprudently granted to M. Charles Robert. Deeply affected with the scene he had witnessed, the prince returned directly home after quitting the Rue du Temple, putting off till the next day the visit he purposed paying to Mlle. Rigolette and the distressed family of the unfortunate artisan, of whom we have spoken, believing them out of the reach of present want, thanks to the money he had given Madame d'Harville to convey to them, in order that her pretended charitable visit to the house might assume a more convincing appearance in the eyes of her husband. Unfortunately, Rodolph was ignorant of Tortillard's having possessed himself of the purse, although the reader has already been told how the artful young thief contrived to effect the barefaced cheat. After 4 o'clock the prince received the following letter, which was brought by an old woman, who went away the instant she had delivered it without awaiting any answer. "My lord, I owe you more than life, and I would fain express my heartfelt gratitude for the invaluable service you have rendered me to day. To morrow shame would, perhaps, close my lips. If your royal highness will honour me with a call this evening, you will finish the day as you began it, by a generous action. D'Orbigny d'Harville. P.S. Do not, my lord, take the trouble to write an answer. I shall be at home all the evening." However rejoiced Rodolph felt at having been the happy instrument of good to Madame d'Harville, he yet could not help regretting the sort of forced intimacy which this circumstance all at once established between himself and the marquise. Deeply struck with the graceful vivacity and extreme beauty of Clémence, yet wholly incapable of infringing upon the friendship which existed between himself and the marquis, Rodolph, directly he became aware of the passion which was springing up in his heart for the wife of his friend, almost denied himself, after having previously devoted a whole month to the most assiduous attentions, the pleasure of beholding her. And now, too, he recollected with much emotion the conversation he had overheard at the embassy between Tom and Sarah, when the latter, by way of accounting for her hatred and jealousy, had affirmed, and not without truth, that Madame d'Harville still felt, even unknown to herself, a serious affection for Rodolph. Sarah was too acute, too penetrating, too well versed in the knowledge of the human heart, not to be well aware that Clémence, believing herself scorned by a man who had made so deep an impression on her heart, and yielding, from the effects of her irritated feelings, to the importunities of a perfidious friend, might be induced to interest herself in the imaginary woes of M. Charles Robert, without consequently forgetting Rodolph. Other women, faithful to the memory of a man they had once distinguished, would have remained indifferent to the melancholy looks of the commandant. Clémence d'Harville was therefore doubly blamable, although she had only yielded to the seduction of unhappiness, and, fortunately for her, had been preserved alike by a keen sense of duty and the remembrance of the prince, which still lurked in her heart, and kept faithful watch over it, from the commission of an irreparable fault. A thousand contradictory emotions disturbed the mind of Rodolph, as he thought of his interview with Madame d'Harville. Firmly resolved to resist the predilection which attracted him to her society, sometimes he congratulated himself on being able to cast off his love for her by the recollection of her having entangled herself with such a being as Charles Robert; and the next instant he bitterly deplored seeing the flattering veil with which he had invested his idol fall to the ground. Clémence d'Harville, on her part, awaited the approaching interview with much anxiety; but the two prevailing sentiments which pervaded her breast were painful confusion, when she remembered the interference of Rodolph, and a fixed aversion when she thought of M. Charles Robert, and many reasons were concerned in this feeling of dislike almost approaching hatred itself. A woman will risk her honour or her life for a man, but she will never pardon him for having placed her in a mortifying or a ridiculous situation. Madame d'Harville felt her cheeks flush, and her pulse beat rapidly as she indignantly recalled the insulting looks and impertinent remarks of Madame Pipelet. Nor was this all. After receiving from Rodolph an intimation of the danger she was incurring, Clémence had proceeded rapidly towards the 5th floor, as directed, but the position of the staircase was such that, as she hurried on, she perceived M. Charles Robert in his dazzling robe de chambre, at the very instant when, recognising the light step of the woman he expected, he, with a self-satisfied, confident, and triumphant look, set the door of his apartment half open. The air of insolent familiarity, expressed by the négligée toilette he had assumed, quickly enabled the marquise to perceive how entirely she had been mistaken in his character. Led away by the kindness and goodness of her heart, and the generosity of her disposition, to take a step which might for ever destroy her reputation, she had accorded this meeting, not from love, but solely from commiseration, in order to console him for the ridiculous part the bad taste of the Duc de Lucenay had made him play before her at the embassy. Words can ill describe the disgust and vexation with which Madame d'Harville beheld the slipshod déshabillé of the commandant, implying as it did his opinion how completely her ill-judged condescension had broken down the barriers of etiquette, and led him to consider no further respect towards her necessary. The timepiece in the small salon which Madame d'Harville ordinarily occupied struck 9 o'clock. Dressmakers and tavern keepers have so much abused the style of Louis XV. And the Renaissance, that the marquise, a woman of infinite taste, had excluded from her apartments this description of ornament, now become so vulgarised, and confined it to that part of the hôtel devoted to the reception of visitors and grand entertainments. Nothing could be more elegant or more distingué than the fitting up of the salon in which the marquise awaited Rodolph. The colour of the walls as well as the curtains, which, without either valances or draperies, were of Indian texture, was bright straw colour, on which were embroidered, in a darker shade, in unwrought silk, arabesques of the most beautiful designs and whimsical devices. Double curtains of point d'Alençon entirely concealed the windows. The rosewood doors were set off with gold mouldings, most beautifully carved, surrounding in each panel an oval medallion of Sèvres china, nearly a foot in diameter, representing a numberless variety of birds and flowers of surpassing brilliancy and beauty. The frames of the looking glasses and the cornices of the curtains were also of rosewood, ornamented with similar raised work of silver gilt. The white marble mantelpiece, with its supporting caryatides of antique beauty and exquisite grace, was from the chisel of the proud and imperious Marochetti, that great artist having consented to sculpture this delicious chef d'oeuvre in imitation of Benvenuto Cellini, who disdained not to model ewers and armour. 2 candelabras and 2 candlesticks of vermeil, forming groups of small figures beautifully executed, stood on either side of the timepiece, which was formed of a square block of lapis lazuli raised on a pedestal of oriental jasper, and surmounted with a large and magnificently enamelled golden cup, richly studded with rubies and pearls, once the property of the Florentine Republic. Several excellent pictures of the Venetian school, of middle size, completed this assemblage of elegance and refined taste. Thanks to a most charming invention but recently introduced, this splendid yet simple apartment was lighted only by the soft rays of a lamp, the unground surface of whose crystal globe was half hid among a mass of real flowers, contained in an immensely large and deep blue and gold Japan cup, suspended from the ceiling like a lustre by 3 chains of vermeil, around which were entwined the green stalks of several climbing plants; while some of the flexible branches, thickly laden with flowers, overhanging the edge of the cup and hanging gracefully down, formed a waving fringe of fresh verdure, beautifully contrasting with the blue and gold enamel of the purple porcelain. We have been thus precise in these details, trifling as they may seem, in order to give some idea of the exquisite taste possessed by Madame d'Harville, the almost invariable companion of an elevated mind, and also because misfortunes always strike us more poignantly cruel when they insinuate themselves into abodes like this, the favoured possessors of which seem gifted by Providence with everything to make life happy and enviable. Buried in the downy softness of a large armchair, totally covered by the same straw-coloured Indian silk as formed the rest of the hangings, Clémence d'Harville sat, awaiting the arrival of Rodolph. Her hair was arranged in the most simple manner. She wore a high dress of black velvet, which well displayed the beauty and admirable workmanship of her large collar and cuffs of English lace, which prevented the extreme black of the velvet from contrasting too harshly with the dazzling whiteness of her throat and hands. In proportion as the hour approached for her interview with Rodolph, the emotion of the marquise increased; but by degrees her embarrassment ceased, and firmer resolves took possession of her mind. After a long and mature reflection, she came to the determination of confiding to Rodolph a great, a cruel secret, hoping by her frankness to win back that esteem she now so highly prized. Awakened by gratitude, her pristine admiration of Rodolph returned with fresh force. One of those secret whispers, which rarely deceives the heart that loves, told her that chance alone had not brought the prince so opportunely to her succour, and that his studied avoidance of her society during the last few months had originated in anything but indifference. A vague suspicion also arose in her mind as to the reality and sincerity of the affection Sarah professed for her. While deeply meditating on all these things, a valet de chambre, having first gently tapped at the door, entered, saying, "Will it please you, my lady, to see Madame Ashton and my young lady?" Madame d'Harville made an affirmative gesture of assent, and a little girl slowly entered the room. The child was about 4 years old, and her countenance would have been a very charming one but for its sickly pallor and extreme meagreness. Madame Ashton, the governess, held her by the hand, but directly Claire, that was the name of the little girl, saw her mother, she opened her arms, and, spite of her feebleness, ran towards her. Her light brown hair was plaited, and tied at each side of her forehead with bows of cherry-coloured riband. Her health was so delicate that she wore a wrapping dress of dark brown silk instead of one of those pretty little white muslin frocks trimmed with ribbons of a similar colour as those in the hair, and well cut over the bosom to show the plump, pinky arms and smooth, fair shoulders so lovely in healthy children. So sunken were the cheeks of poor Claire that her large dark eyes looked quite enormous. But, spite of every appearance of weakness, a sweet and gentle smile lit up her small features when she was placed on the lap of her mother, whom she kissed and embraced with intense yet mournful affection. "How has she been of late, Madame Ashton?" inquired Madame d'Harville of the governess. "Tolerably well, madame, although at one time I feared." "Again!" cried Clémence, pressing her daughter to her heart with a movement of involuntary horror. "Fortunately, madame, I was mistaken," said the governess, "and the whole passed away without any further alarm. Mademoiselle Claire became composed, and merely suffered from a momentary feeling of weakness. She had not slept much this afternoon, but I could not coax her to bed without allowing her the pleasure of paying a visit to you." "Dear little angel!" cried Madame d'Harville, covering her daughter with kisses. The interesting child repaid her mother's caresses with infantine delight, when the groom of the chambers entered and announced, "His Royal Highness the Grand Duke of Gerolstein." Claire, standing on her mother's lap, had thrown her arms about her neck, and was clasping her with all the force of which her tiny arms were capable. At the sight of Rodolph, Clémence blushed deeply, set her child gently down on the carpet, and signed to Madame Ashton to take her away. She then rose to receive her guest. "You must give me leave," said Rodolph, smilingly, after having respectfully bowed to the marquise, "to renew my acquaintance with my little friend here, who I fear has almost forgotten me." And, stooping down a little, he extended his hand to Claire, who, first gazing at him with her large eyes, curiously scrutinised his features, then, recognising him, she made a gentle inclination of the head, and blew him a kiss from the tips of her small thin fingers. "You remember my lord, then, my child?" asked Clémence of little Claire, who gave an assenting nod, and kissed her hand to Rodolph a second time. "Her health appears to be much improved since I last saw her," said he, addressing himself with unfeigned interest to Clémence. "Thank heaven, my lord, she is better, though still sadly delicate and suffering." The marquise and the prince, mutually embarrassed at the thoughts of the approaching interview, would have been equally glad to defer its commencement through the medium of Claire's presence; but the discreet Madame Ashton having taken her away, Rodolph and Clémence were left quite alone. The armchair in which Madame d'Harville was reclining stood on the right hand of the chimney, and Rodolph remained without attempting to seat himself, gracefully leaning his elbow on the mantelpiece. Never had Clémence been so strongly impressed with admiration at the noble and prepossessing appearance of the prince; never had his voice sounded more gentle or sweet upon her ear. Fully understanding how painful it must be to the marquise to open the conversation, Rodolph at once proceeded to the main point by observing: "You have been, madame, the victim of a base and treacherous action. A cowardly and dishonourable disclosure on the part of the Countess Macgregor has well nigh effected irremediable mischief." "Is it indeed so?" exclaimed Clémence, painfully surprised. "Then my presentiments were not ill founded. And by what means did your royal highness discover this?" "Last night, at the ball given by the Countess , I discovered this infamous secret. I was sitting in a lone part of the winter garden, when Countess Sarah and her brother, unconscious that a mass of verdure along concealed me from them, while it enabled me to hear each word they spoke, began conversing freely upon their own projects, and the snare they had spread for you. Anxious to warn you of the danger with which you were threatened, I hastened to Madame de Nerval's ball, hoping to meet you there, but you did not appear. To write and direct my letter here was to incur the risk of its falling into the hands of the marquis, whose suspicions were already aroused by your treacherous friend, and I therefore preferred awaiting your arrival in the Rue du Temple, that I might unfold to you the perfidy of Countess Macgregor. Let me hope you will pardon my thus long dwelling on a subject which must be so painful to you; and but for the few lines you were kind enough to write, never would my lips have in any way reverted to it." After a momentary silence, Madame d'Harville said to Rodolph: "There is but one way, my lord, in which I can prove to you my gratitude for your late generous conduct. It is to confess to you that which I have never revealed to a human being. What I have to say will not exculpate me in your estimation, but it will, perhaps, enable you to make some allowances for my imprudence." "Candidly speaking, madame," said Rodolph, smiling, "my position as regards you is a very embarrassing one." Clémence, astonished at the most jesting tone in which he spoke, looked at Rodolph with extreme surprise, while she said: "How so, my lord?" "Thanks to a circumstance you are doubtless acquainted with, I am obliged to assume the grave airs of a mentor touching an incident which, since you have so happily escaped the vile snare laid for you by Countess Sarah, scarcely merits being treated with so much importance. But," continued Rodolph, with a slight shade of gentle and affectionate earnestness, "your husband and myself are almost as brothers; and before our time our fathers had vowed the sincerest friendship for each other. I have, therefore, a double motive in most warmly congratulating you on having secured the peace and happiness of your husband. And it is from my knowledge of the high regard and esteem with which you honour M. d'Harville, that I have determined upon revealing the whole truth, as well as to explain myself relative to an interest which must appear to you as ill chosen and unworthy as it now seems to me. I wish also to clear up that part of my conduct which bears an injurious appearance against the tranquillity and honour of him your highness styles almost a brother."
Believe me, madame, I shall at all times be most proud and happy to receive the smallest proof of your confidence. Yet permit me to say, as regards the interest you speak of, that I am perfectly aware it originated as much in sincere pity as from the constant importunities of Countess Sarah Macgregor, who had her own reasons for seeking to injure you. And I also know equally well that you long hesitated ere you could make up your mind to take the step you now so much regret." Clémence looked at the prince with surprise. "You seem astonished. Well, that you may not fancy I dabble in witchcraft, some of these days I will tell you all about it," said Rodolph, smiling. "But your husband is perfectly tranquillised, is he not?" "Yes, my lord," said Clémence, looking down in much confusion; "and it is most painful to me to hear him asking my pardon for having ever suspected me, and then eulogising my modest silence respecting my good deeds." "Nay, do not chide an illusion which renders him so happy. On the contrary, endeavour to maintain the innocent deception. Were it not forbidden to treat your late adventure lightly, and had not you, madame, been so much involved in it, I would say that a woman never appears more charming in the eyes of her husband than when she has some fault to conceal. It is inconceivable how many little cajoleries and what winning smiles are employed to ease a troubled conscience. When I was young," added Rodolph, smiling, "I always, in spite of myself, mistrusted any unusual marks of tenderness; and by the same rule I can say of myself that I never felt more disposed to appear in an amiable light than when I was conscious of requiring forgiveness. So, directly I perceived a more than ordinary anxiety to please and gratify me, I was very sure, judging by my own conduct, to ascribe it to some little peccadillo that needed overlooking and pardoning." CHAPTR XII. Part II of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris, by Eugène. Chapter XI. Part II. The light tone with which Rodolph continued to discuss an affair which might have been attended with circumstances so fearful at first excited Madame d'Harville's wonder; but she quickly perceived that the prince, beneath his outward appearance of trifling, sought to conceal, or at least lessen, the importance of the service he had rendered her; and, profoundly touched with his delicacy, she said: "I comprehend your generous meaning, my lord, and you are fully at liberty to jest, and forget as much as you like the peril from which you have preserved me. But that which I have to relate to you is of so grave, so serious, and mournful a nature, is so closely connected with the events of this morning, and your advice may so greatly benefit me, that I beseech you to remember that to you I owe both my honour and my life. Yes, my lord, my life. My husband was armed, and he has owned, in the excess of his repentance, that it was his intention to have killed me, had his suspicions proved correct." "Great God!" exclaimed Rodolph, with emotion. "And he would have been justified in so doing," rejoined Madame d'Harville, bitterly. "I beseech you, madame," said Rodolph, and this time he spoke with deep seriousness, "I beseech you to be assured I am incapable of being careless or indifferent to any matter in which you are concerned. If I seemed but now to jest, it was but to make you think less of a circumstance which has already occasioned you so much pain. But now, madame, you may command my most solemn attention. Since you honour me by saying my advice may be useful, I listen most anxiously and eagerly." "You can, indeed, counsel me most beneficially, my lord. But before I explain to you my reasons for seeking your aid, I must say a few words concerning a period of which you are ignorant. I mean the years which preceded my marriage with M. d'Harville." Rodolph bowed, and Clémence continued: "At 16 years of age I lost my mother," and here a tear stole down the fair cheek of Madame d'Harville. "I cannot attempt to describe how much I adored that beloved parent. Imagine, my lord, the very personification of all earthly goodness. Her fondness for me was excessive, and appeared her only consolation amid the many bitter sorrows she had to endure. Caring but little for what is styled the world, with delicate health, and a natural predilection for sedentary occupation, her great delight had been in attending solely to my education, and her ample store of solid and varied knowledge well fitted her for the task. Conceive, my lord, her astonishment and mine when, in my 16th year,
My dear preceptress considered my education nearly completed, my father, making the feeble health of my mother a pretext, announced to us that a young and accomplished widow, whose misfortunes rendered her justly interesting, would henceforth be charged with finishing what my dear parent had begun. My mother at first resolutely refused obedience to my father's command, while I in vain besought him not to interpose a stranger's authority between myself and my beloved mother. He was inexorable alike to our tears and prayers, and Madame Roland, who stated herself to be the widow of a colonel who had died in India, came to take up her abode with us, in the character of governess to myself." "What! The same Madame Roland your father married almost immediately after the death of your mother?" "The same, my lord." "Was she, then, very beautiful?" "Tolerably so; nothing more." "Clever? Witty, perhaps?" "She was a clever dissembler, a skilful manoeuvrer; her talent went no higher. She might be about 25 years of age, with extremely light hair and nearly white eyelashes; her eyes were large, round, and a clear blue. The expression of her countenance was humble and gentle; and, while her outward manner was attentive even to servility, her real disposition was as perfidious as it was unfeeling." "And what were her acquirements?" "Positively none at all, my lord; and I cannot conceive how my father, who until then had been so completely a slave to the dictates of worldly propriety, did not reflect that the utter incapacity of this woman must shamefully proclaim the real cause of her being in the house. My mother earnestly pointed out to him the extreme ignorance of Madame Roland. He, however, merely replied, in a tone which admitted of no further argument, that, competent or otherwise, the young and interesting widow should retain the situation in his establishment in which he had placed her. This I heard subsequently. From that instant my poor mother comprehended the whole affair, over which she deeply grieved, regretting less, I fancy, her husband's infidelity than the domestic unhappiness which would result from so indecorous a liaison, the account of which she feared might reach my ears. But even so far as his foolish passion was concerned, it seems to me that your father acted very unwisely in introducing this woman into his house; and you would still be more at a loss to understand his conduct if you had but known the extreme formality and circumspection of his character. Nothing could have ever induced him thus to trample under foot all the established rules of society but the unbounded influence of Madame Roland, and influence she exercised with so much the more certainty as she veiled her designs under the mask of the most passionate love for him." "But what was your father's age then?" "About 60." "And he really credited the professions of love made by so much younger a woman?" "My father had been in his time one of the most fashionable and admired men of the day; and Madame Roland, either following the suggestions of her own artful mind, or urged on by the counsels of others, who could countenance much more—" "Counsel such a person?" "I will tell you, my lord. Imagining that a man whose reputation for gallantry had always stood high in the world would, as he advanced in years, be more easily delighted than another by being flattered upon his personal advantages, and more credulously receive such compliments as served to recall those days most soothing to his vanity to remember, well, my lord, incredible as it may appear, this woman began to flatter my poor misguided father upon the graceful tournure of his features and the inimitable elegance of his shape. And he in his 60th year! Strange as you may consider it, spite of the excellent sense with which my father was endowed, he fell blindly into the snare, coarse and vulgar as it was. Such was, such still is, I doubt not, the secret of the unbounded influence this woman obtained over him. And really, my lord, in spite of my present disinclination for mirth, I can scarcely restrain a smile at the recollection of having frequently, before my marriage, heard Madame Roland assert and maintain that what she styled real maturity was the finest portion of a person's existence, and that this maturity never began until about the 55th or 60th year of one's age." "I suppose that happened to be your father's age?" "Precisely so, my lord. Then, and then only, according to Madame Roland, had the understanding, combined with experience, attained their full development; then only could a man, occupying a distinguished position in the world, enjoy the consideration to which he was entitled. At that period only were the tout ensemble of his countenance, and the exquisite grace of his manners, in their highest perfection. the physiognomy offering at this delightful epoch of a man's life a heavenly mixture of winning serenity and gentle gravity. Then the slight tinge of melancholy, caused by the many recollections of the past deceit experience is fain to look back upon, completes the irresistible charm of real maturity, unappreciable, Madame Roland hastily added, except by women with head and heart sufficiently good to despise the youthful frivolity of a poor, inexperienced 40 years, when the character and countenance can scarcely be called formed, and when good taste turns away from the boyish folly of such an immature season of life, and seeks the fine, majestic features impressed with the sublime and poetic expression resulting from a 60-years' study of the vast book of human existence. Rodolph could not restrain smiling at the powerful irony with which Madame d'Harville sketched the portrait of her mother in law. "There is one thing," said he to the marquise, "for which I cannot forgive ridiculous people." "What is that, my lord?" "The being also wicked, which prevents our being able to laugh at them as much as they deserve." "They probably calculate upon that available advantage," replied Clémence. "Indeed, it is very probable, though equally lamentable, for, if it were not for the recollection of all the pain Madame Roland has occasioned you, I could be highly diverted with her system of real maturity, as opposed to the insipidity of mere boys of only 40 years of age, who, according to her assertion, would be scarcely out of their leading strings, as our grandfathers and grandmothers would say." "What principally excited my aversion for her was the shamefulness of her conduct towards my dear mother, and the unfortunately over zealous part she took in my marriage," said the marquise, after a moment's pause. Rodolph looked at her with much surprise. "Nay, my lord," said Clémence, in a firm, though gentle tone, "I well remember that M. d'Harville is your friend and my husband. I know perfectly the grave importance of the words I have just uttered. Hereafter you yourself shall admit the justice of them. But to return to Madame Roland, who was now, spite of her acknowledged incapacity, established as my instructress, my mother had a long and most painful altercation with my father on the subject, which drew down on us his extreme displeasure, and from that period my mother and myself remained secluded in our apartments, while Madame Roland, in quality of my governess, directed the whole household, and almost publicly did the honours of the mansion."
"What must your mother have suffered!"
"She did, indeed, my lord; but her sorrow was less for herself than me, whose future destiny might be so deeply affected by the introduction of this woman. Her health, always delicate, became daily weaker, and she fell seriously ill. It chanced, most unfortunately, that our family doctor, M. Sorbier, in whom she had the highest confidence, died about this period, to my mother's extreme regret. Madame Roland immediately urged my father to place my mother's case in the hands of an Italian doctor, a particular friend of her own, and whom she described as possessing a more than ordinary skill in the treatment of diseases. Thanks to her importunities, my father, who had himself consulted him in trifling maladies, and found no cause to be dissatisfied, proposed him to my mother, who, alas, raised no objection. And this man it was who attended upon her during her last illness." Tears filled the eyes of Madame d'Harville as she uttered these words. "I am ashamed to confess my weakness, my lord," added she; "but, for the simple reason of this doctor having been appointed at the suggestion of Madame Roland, he inspired me, and at that time without any cause, with the most involuntary repugnance, and it was with the most painful misgivings I saw him established in my mother's confidence. Still, as regarded his knowledge of his profession, Doctor Polidori—" "What do I hear?" exclaimed Rodolph. "Are you indisposed, my lord?" inquired Clémence, struck with the sudden expression the prince's countenance had assumed. "No, no," said Rodolph, as though unconscious of the presence of Madame d'Harville. "No, I must be mistaken. 5 or 6 years must have elapsed since all this occurred, while I am informed that it is not more than 2 years since Polidori came to Paris, and then under a feigned name. He it was I saw yesterday, I am sure of it. The quack dentists Bradamanti and Polidori are one and the same. Still, 'tis singular, 2 doctors of the same name. What a strange rencontre! We must remind the reader that Polidori was a doctor of some eminence when he undertook the education of Rodolph." Madame," said Rodolph, turning to Madame d'Harville, whose astonishment at his preoccupation still increased, "we will, if you please, compare notes as to this Italian. What age was he?" "About 50." "And his appearance, his countenance?" "Most sinister. Never shall I forget his clear, piercing green eye, and his nose curved like the bill of an eagle." "'Tis he himself!" exclaimed Rodolph. "And do you think, madame, that the Doctor Polidori you were describing is still in Paris?" "That I cannot tell you, my lord. He quitted Paris about a year after my father's marriage. A lady of my acquaintance, who at this period also employed the Italian as her medical adviser, this lady, Madame de Lucenay—" "The Duchess de Lucenay?" interrupted Rodolph. "Yes, my lord. But why this surprise?" "Permit me to be silent on that subject. But, at the time of which you speak, what did Madame de Lucenay tell you of this man?" "She said that he travelled much after quitting Paris, and that she often received from him very clever and amusing letters, descriptive of the various places he visited. Now I recollect that, about a month ago, happening to ask Madame de Lucenay whether she had heard lately from M. Polidori, she replied, with an embarrassed manner, that nothing had been heard of or concerning him for some time; that no one knew what had become of him, and that by many he was supposed to be dead." "Strange, indeed!" said Rodolph, recalling the recent visit of Madame de Lucenay to the charlatan Bradamanti. "You know this man, then, my lord?" "Unfortunately for myself, I do. But let me beseech you to continue your recital. Hereafter I will give you an insight into the history of this Polidori." "Do you mean the doctor?" "Say, rather, the wretch stained with the most atrocious crimes." "Crimes!" cried Madame d'Harville, in alarm. "Can it be possible? The man whom Madame Roland so highly extolled, and into whose hands my poor mother was delivered, was guilty of crimes? Alas, my dear parent lingered but a very short time after she passed into his care. Ah, my lord, my presentiments have not deceived me." "Your presentiments?" "Oh, yes. I was telling you just now of the invincible antipathy I felt for this man from the circumstance of his having been introduced among us by Madame Roland; but I did not tell you all, my lord." "How so?" "I was fearful lest the bitterness of my own griefs should make me guilty of injustice towards an innocent person. But now, my lord, you shall know everything. My mother had lain dangerously ill about 5 days. I had always watched beside her, night as well as day. One evening, that I felt much oppressed with confinement and fatigue, I went to breathe the fresh air on the terrace of the garden. After remaining about a quarter of an hour, I was returning by a long and obscure gallery. By a faint light which streamed from the apartment of Madame Roland, I saw M. Polidori quit the room, accompanied by the mistress of the chamber. Being in the shadow, they did not perceive me. Madame Roland spoke some words to the doctor, but in so low a tone I could not catch them. The doctor's answer was given in a louder key, and consisted only of these words, 'The day after to morrow;' and when Madame Roland seemed to urge him, still in so low a voice as to prevent the words reaching me, he replied, with singular emphasis, 'The day after to morrow, I tell you, the day after to morrow.'" "What could those words mean?" "What did they mean? Alas, alas, my lord, it was on the Wednesday evening I heard M. Polidori say, 'the day after to morrow.' On the Friday, my mother was a corpse." "Horrible, indeed!" "After this mournful event I was consigned to the care of a relation, who, forgetful of the afflicted state of my mind, as well as tender age, told me, without reserve or consideration of the consequences, what powerful reasons there were for my hating Madame Roland, and fully enlightened me as to the ambitious projects entertained by this woman. Full well I could then imagine all my poor mother must have endured. I thought my heart would break the first time I again saw my father, which was upon the occasion of his coming to fetch me from the house of my relation to take me into Normandy, where we were to pass the first months of our mourning. During the journey he informed me, without the least embarrassment, and as though it had been the most natural thing in the world, that, out of regard for himself and me, madame had kindly consented to take the command of the establishment, and to act as my guide and friend. On arriving at Aubiers, so was my father's estate called, the first object we beheld was Madame Roland, who had established herself here on the very day of my mother's death. Spite of her modest, gentle manner, her countenance betrayed an ill disguised triumph. Never shall I forget the look, at once ironical and spiteful, she cast on me as I descended from the carriage. It seemed to say, "I am mistress here; 'tis you who are the intruder." A fresh grief awaited me, whether from an inexcusable want of proper judgment or unpardonable assurance, this woman occupied the apartment which had been my mother's. In my just indignation I loudly complained to my father of this unpleasant forgetfulness of my rights as well as wishes. He reprimanded me severely for making any remonstrance on the subject, adding that it was needless for me either to feel or express surprise on the subject, as it was his desire I should habituate myself to consider Madame Roland in every respect as a second mother, and show her a corresponding deference. I replied that it would be a profanation to that sacred name to act as he commanded; and, to his extreme wrath, I never allowed any opportunity to escape by which I could evince my deeply rooted aversion to Madame Roland. At times my father's rage knew no bounds, and bitterly would he reproach me in the presence of that woman for the coldness and ingratitude of my conduct towards an angel, as he styled her, sent by Heaven for our consolation and happiness. "Let me entreat of you to speak for yourself alone," said I, one day, quite wearied with the hypocritical conduct of Madame Roland and my father's blind infatuation. The harshness and unreasonableness of his conduct became at last quite unendurable; while Madame Roland, with the honeyed words of feigned affection, would artfully intercede for me, because she well knew by so doing she should only increase the storm she had raised. "You must make some allowances for Clémence," she would say; "the sorrow she experiences for the excellent parent we all deplore is so natural, and even praiseworthy, that you should respect her just grief, and pity her for her unfounded suspicions. You hear her, you hear her!" would my father exclaim, pointing with mingled triumph and admiration to the accomplished hypocrite. "What angelic goodness! What enchanting nobleness and generosity! Instantly entreat her pardon for the unworthiness of your conduct." "Never," I used to reply. "The spirit of my angel mother, who now beholds me, would be pained to witness such a degradation in her child;" and, bursting with grief and mortification, I would fly to my own chamber, leaving my father to dry the tears and calm the ruffled feelings of the woman I despised and hated. You will, I hope, excuse me, my lord, for dwelling so long and so minutely on all my earthly troubles, but it is only by doing so I can accurately describe to you the sort of life I led at that period.
I can enter fully into the painful subject, yet how often have the same scenes been enacted in other families, and still, it is much to be feared, will they be repeated till the end of time. But in what capacity did your father introduce Madame Roland to the neighbourhood?"
"As my instructress and his friend, and she was estimated accordingly."
"I need scarcely inquire whether he shared in the solitude to which her questionable character condemned the lady?"
"With the exception of some few and unavoidable visits, she saw no one. My father, guided by his passion, or influenced by Madame Roland, threw off his mourning for my mother ere he had worn it 3 months, under the plea that the sable garb continually reminded him of his loss, and prevented him from regaining his lost tranquillity. His manners to me daily became colder and more estranged, while his perfect indifference concerning me allowed a degree of liberty almost incredible in a person of my age. I met him only at breakfast, after which he returned to his study with Madame Roland, who acted as his secretary, read and answered all his letters, etc. That completed, they either walked or drove out together, returning only an hour before dinner, against which Madame Roland would array herself in an elegant and well chosen evening dress; while my father would make a most studiously elaborate toilet, as uncalled for as ill adapted to his time of life. Occasionally, after dinner, he received a few persons he could not avoid asking to his house, when he would play at tric trac with Madame Roland until 10 o'clock, at which hour he would offer his arm to conduct her to my mother's apartment, and return to his guests. As for myself, I had unrestrained permission to go where I pleased throughout the whole day. Attended by a servant, I used to take long rides in the extensive woods surrounding the château, and when, as occasionally happened, I felt my spirits unequal to appearing at the dinner table, Not the slightest inquiry was ever made after me, or my absence noticed."
"What singular neglect and forgetfulness!"
"Having accidentally encountered one of our neighbours during several successive days of my excursions in the woods, I gave up riding there, and confined myself entirely to the park."
"And how did this infamous woman conduct herself towards you when alone?"
"She shunned all occasions of being with me as sedulously as I avoided her; but once that we were unexpectedly tête à tête with each other, and that she was reproaching me for some severe words I had spoken the preceding evening, she said coldly, 'Have a care, you cannot contend against my power; any such attempt will bring down a certain ruin on your head.' 'As it did upon that of my mother,' answered I. 'It is a pity, madame, you have not M. Polidori by your side, to announce to you that your vengeance can be satisfied the day after to morrow.'"
"And what reply did she make when you thus recalled those fearful words?"
"She changed colour rapidly, her features were almost convulsed; then, by a strong effort conquering her emotion, she angrily demanded what I meant by the expression. 'Ask your own heart, madame,' answered I; 'in the solitude of your chamber inquire of yourself to what I allude. Your conscience will find a ready explanation.' Shortly after that, a scene occurred which for ever sealed my destiny. Among a great number of family portraits which graced the walls of the salon in which we usually spent the evening was that of my mother. One day I observed it had been removed from its accustomed place. Two neighbours had dined with us; one of them, a M. Dorval, a country lawyer, had always expressed the utmost veneration and respect for my mother. When we reached the salon after dinner, I inquired of my father what had become of my dear mother's picture. 'Cease!' cried my father, significantly pointing to our guests, as though intimating his desire that they should not hear any discussion on the subject. 'The reason of the picture being taken away is that the sight of it continually reminded me of the heavy loss I have sustained, and so prevented my regaining my usual calmness and peace of mind.' 'And where is the portrait at present?' inquired I. Turning towards Madame Roland, with an impatient and uneasy air, he said, 'Where has the picture been put?' 'In the lumber room,' replied she, casting on me a glance of defiance, evidently under the impression that the presence of witnesses would prevent me from proceeding further in the matter. 'I can easily believe, madame,' cried I, indignantly, 'that the recollection of my mother must have been painful to you; but that was not a sufficient reason for banishing from the walls a likeness of her who, when you were in want and misery, kindly and charitably afforded you the shelter of her roof.'"
"Excellent!" exclaimed Rodolph. "Yours was, indeed, a stinging and a just reproach."
"Mademoiselle," cried my father, "you forget that this lady has watched and still continues to preside with maternal solicitude over your education. You also seem to banish from your recollection the very high esteem and respect you are aware I entertain for her; and, since you allow yourself thus to attack her before strangers, you will permit me to tell you that, in my opinion, the charge of ingratitude lies at the door of her who, overlooking the tender cares she has received, presumes to reproach a person deserving of the utmost interest and respect, with misfortunes and calamities so nobly sustained. I cannot venture to discuss the subject with you, my dear father," said I, submissively. "Perhaps, then, mademoiselle, you will favour me with your polite arguments in favour of rudeness and unmerited abuse," cried Madame Roland, carried away by rage into a neglect of her usual caution and prudence. "Perhaps you will permit me to assert that, so far from owing the slightest obligation to your mother, I have nothing to remember but the constant coldness and dislike she invariably manifested towards me, fully expressive of the disgust and displeasure with which my residence in the house inspired her." "Forbear, madame," explained I, interrupting her. "Out of respect for my father, if not to spare your own blushes, cease such shameful confessions as the one you have just made, or you will make even me regret having exposed you to so humiliating a disclosure."
"Better and better!" cried Rodolph. "This was, indeed, cutting with a two-edged sword. Pray go on. And what said this woman?"
"By a very hackneyed, though convenient expedient, Madame Roland contrived to end a scene in which she felt she was likely to have the worst. With a sudden cry, she threw herself into a chair, and very naturally imitated a fainting fit. Thanks to this incident, the two visitors quitted the room in search of restoratives; while I retired to my own apartment, leaving my father hanging in deep anxiety over the wicked cause of all this confusion.
Doubtless your next interview with your father must have been a stormy one.
Chapter 11. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 11, Part 3 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Chapter 11, Part 3. He came to me next morning, and, without further preamble, addressed me as follows: "In order to prevent a recurrence of the disgraceful scene of yesterday, I think proper to inform you, that, immediately that decency permits both you and myself to throw off our mourning, it is my intention to celebrate my marriage with Madame Roland, which will compel you to treat her with the respect and deference due to my wife. For certain reasons, it is expedient you should marry before me. You will have as a dowry your mother's fortune, amounting to more than 1,000,000 francs. From this very day I shall take the necessary steps to form a suitable match for you, and for that purpose I shall accept one of the many offers I have received for your hand." After this conversation, I lived more alone than ever, never meeting my father except at meal times, which generally passed off in the utmost silence. So really dull and lonely was my present existence, that I only waited for my father to propose any suitor he might approve of, to accept him with perfect willingness. Madame Roland, having relinquished all further ill-natured remarks upon the memory of my deceased parent, indemnified herself by inflicting on me the continual pain of seeing her appropriate to herself the various trifles my dear mother had exclusively made use of. Her easy chair, embroidery frame, the books which composed her private library, even a screen I myself had embroidered for her, and in the centre of which were our united ciphers. This woman laid her sacrilegious hands on all the elegant articles with which my mother's taste and my affection had ornamented her apartments.
I can well imagine all the horror those profanations must have caused you.
Still, great as were my sufferings, the state of loneliness in which I found myself rendered them even greater."
"And you had no one, no person in whom you could confide?"
"No one. But at this time I received a touching proof of the interest my fate excited, and which might have opened my eyes to the dangers preparing for me. One of the two persons present during the scene with Madame Roland I so lately described was a M. Dorval, a worthy old notary, to whom my mother had rendered some signal service. By my father's orders, I never since then entered the salon when strangers were there. I had never therefore seen M. Dorval after the eventful day when I spoke so undisguisedly to Madame Roland. Great, therefore, was my surprise to see him coming towards me one day in the park, while I was taking my accustomed walk.
'Mademoiselle,' said he to me with a mysterious air, 'I am fearful of being observed by your father. Here is a letter, read it, and destroy it immediately. Its contents are most important to you.'
So saying, he disappeared as quickly as he came. In the letter he informed me that it was in agitation to marry me to the Marquis d'Harville, and that the match appeared in every respect eligible, inasmuch as every one concurred in bearing testimony to the many excellent qualities of M. d'Harville, who was young, rich, good-looking, and highly distinguished for his talents and mental attainments; yet that the families of two young ladies, with whom he had been on the point of marriage, had abruptly broken off the matches. The notary added that, although entirely ignorant of the cause of these ruptures, he still considered it his duty to apprise me of them, without in the slightest degree insinuating that they originated in any circumstance prejudicial to the high opinion entertained of M. d'Harville. The two young ladies alluded to were, one the daughter of M. Beauregard, a peer of France, the other of Lord Dudley. M. Dorval concluded by saying that his motive in making the communication was because my father, in his extreme desire to conclude the marriage, did not appear to attach sufficient importance to the facts now detailed.
"Now you recall it to my recollection," said Rodolph, after some minutes spent in deep meditation on what he had just heard, "I remember that your husband, at intervals of nearly 12 months, told me of 2 marriages which had been broken off just as they were on the point of taking place, and ascribing their abrupt termination to a difficulty in arranging matters of a mere pecuniary nature."
Madame d'Harville smiled bitterly as she replied: "You shall know what those motives really were, my lord, very shortly." After reading the letter, so kindly intentioned on the part of the worthy notary, I felt both my uneasiness and curiosity rapidly increase. Who was D'Harville? My father had never mentioned him to me. In vain I ransacked my memory. I could not recollect ever to have heard the name. Soon, however, the current of my thoughts was directed into another channel by the abrupt departure of Madame Roland for Paris. Although the period of her absence was limited to 8 days at the utmost, yet my father expressed the deepest grief at even this trifling separation from her. His temper became altogether soured, and his coldness towards me hourly increased. He even went so far as to reply, when one day I inquired after his health, "I am ill, and all through you." "Through me!" exclaimed I. "Assuredly through you. You know full well how indispensable to my happiness is the company of Madame Roland, yet this incomparable woman, who has been so grossly insulted by you, has left me to undertake her present journey solely on your account." This mark of interest on the part of Madame Roland filled me with the most lively apprehensions of evil, and a vague presentiment floated across my mind that my marriage was in some way or other mixed up with it. I must leave it to your imagination, my lord, to picture the delight of my father upon the return of my future mother in law. The next day he sent to desire my company. I found him alone with her. "I have for some time," said he, "been thinking of establishing you in the world. In another month your mourning will have expired. To morrow I expect M. d'Harville, a young man possessed of every requisite, both as to fortune and figure, to secure any woman's approbation. He is well looked upon in society, and is capable of securing the happiness of any lady he may seek in marriage. Now, having seen you, though accidentally, his choice has fallen on you. In fact, he is most anxious to obtain your hand. Every pecuniary arrangement is concluded. It therefore remains solely with yourself to be married ere the next 6 weeks have elapsed. If, on the contrary, from any capricious whim impossible for me to foresee, you think fit to refuse the unlooked-for good offer now before you, it will in no respect alter my own plans, as my marriage will take place, according to my original intention, directly my mourning expires. And in this latter case, I am bound to inform you that your presence in my house will not be agreeable to me, unless I have your promise to treat my wife with the respect and tenderness to which she is entitled." "I understand you," replied I. "Whether I accept M. d'Harville or no, you will marry; and my only resource will then be to retire to the convent of the Holy Heart?" "It will," answered he, coldly. "His conduct now ceases to be classed under the term weakness," said Rodolph; "it assumes the form of positive cruelty." "Shall I tell you, my lord, what has always prevented me from feeling the least resentment at my father's conduct? It is because I have always had a strong presentiment that he would one day pay dearly, too dearly, alas! for his blind passion for Madame Roland. Thank heaven, that evil day has not yet arrived." "And did you not mention to your father that the old notary had informed you of the abrupt breaking off of the 2 marriages M. d'Harville had been on the point of contracting?" "Indeed I did, my lord. I signified to my father, upon the occasion of the conversation I was relating to you, a wish to speak with him alone, upon which Madame Roland abruptly rose and quitted the apartment. 'I have no objection to the union you propose with M. d'Harville,' said I, 'only, as I understand, he has twice been upon the point of marriage, and '" "Enough, enough!" interrupted he, hastily. "I know all about those 2 affairs, which were so abruptly broken off merely because matters of pecuniary nature were not satisfactorily arranged; although I am bound to assure you that not the slightest shadow of blame was attributable to M. d'Harville. If that be your only objection, you may consider the match as concluded on and yourself as married, ay, and happily, too; for, spite of your conduct, my first wish is for your happiness." "No doubt Madame Roland was delighted with your marriage?" "Delighted? Yes, my lord," said Clémence, with bitterness. "She was, and well might be, delighted with this union, which was, in fact, of her effecting. She it was who had first suggested it to my father. She knew full well the real occasion of breaking off the marriages so nearly completed by M. d'Harville, and hence arose her exceeding anxiety for him to become my husband." "What motive could she possibly have had?" "She sought to avenge herself on me by condemning me to a life of wretchedness." "But your father?" "Deceived by Madame Roland, He fully and implicitly believed that interested motives alone had set aside the 2 former marriages of M. d'Harville."
"What a horrible scheme! But what was this mysterious reason?"
"You shall know shortly. Well, M. d'Harville arrived at Aubiers, and I confess I was much pleased with his appearance, manners, and cultivated mind. He seemed very amiable and kind, though somewhat melancholy. I remarked in him a contradiction which charmed and astonished me at the same time. His personal and mental advantages were considerable, his fortune princely, and his birth illustrious; yet, at times, the expression of his countenance would change, from a firm and manly energy and decision of purpose, to an almost timid, shrinking look, as though he feared even his own self. Then an utter dejection of spirits and exhaustion would ensue. There was, at these strangely contrasted periods, such a look of deprecating humility, such an appearance of conscious wrong, as touched me deeply, and won my pity to a great extent. I admired greatly the kindness of manner he ever evinced to an old servant, a valet de chambre who had been about him from his birth, and who alone was suffered to attend upon his master now he had reached the man's estate. Shortly after M. d'Harville's arrival he remained for 2 days secluded in his apartment. My father wished to visit him, but the old servant alluded to objected, stating that his master had so violent a headache he would receive no one. When M. d'Harville emerged from his chamber, he was excessively pale, and looked extremely ill. He afterwards appeared to experience a sort of impatience and uneasiness when any reference was made to his temporary indisposition. In proportion as I became better acquainted with M. d'Harville, I discovered that, on many points, a singular similarity of taste existed between us. He had so much to be proud of, and so many reasons for being happy, that his excessive and shrinking modesty struck me as something more than admirable. The day for our marriage being fixed, he seemed to delight in anticipating every wish I could form for the future, and when sometimes I alluded to the deep melancholy which at times possessed him, and begged to know the cause, he would speak of his deceased parents, and of the delight it would have afforded them to see him married, to their heart's dearest wish, to one so justly approved both by his own judgment and affections. I could not well find fault with reasons so complimentary to myself. M. d'Harville easily guessed the terms on which I must have been living with my father and Madame Roland, although the former, delighted at my marriage, which would serve as a plea for accelerating his own, had latterly treated me with excessive tenderness. In some of our conversations, M. d'Harville, with infinite tact and good feeling, explained to me that his regard was considerably heightened by the knowledge of all I had suffered since my dear mother's death. I thought it my duty to hint to him, at such a time, that as my father was about to marry again, it might very possibly affect the property I might be expected to inherit. He would not even permit me to proceed, but most effectually convinced me of his own utterly disinterested motives in seeking my hand. I could not but think that the families, who had so abruptly broken off his former projected alliances, must have been very unreasonable or avaricious people if they made pecuniary matters a stumbling block with one so generous, easy, and liberal as M. d'Harville.
"And such as you describe him, so have I always found him," cried Rodolph, "all heart, disinterestedness, and delicacy. But did you never speak to him of the marriages so hastily broken off?"
"I will confess to you, my lord, that the question was several times on my lips; but, when I recollected the sensitiveness of his nature, I feared to pain him by questions which might, at any rate, have wounded his self-love, or taxed his honour to reply too truly. The nearer the day fixed for our marriage approached, the more delighted did M. d'Harville appear. Yet I several times detected him absorbed in the most perfect dejection, the deepest melancholy. One day, in particular, I caught his eyes fixed on me with a settled gaze, as though resolving to confide to me some important secret he yet could not bring himself to reveal. I perceived a large tear trickle slowly down his cheek, as though wrung from his very heart. The recollection of his 2 former prospects of marriage, so suddenly destroyed, rose to my mind; and, I confess, I almost felt afraid to proceed. A vague presentiment whispered within me that the happiness of my whole life was at stake, perhaps perilled for ever. But then, on the other hand, such was my eager desire to quit my father's house, that I turned a deaf ear to every suggestion of evil arising from my union with M. d'Harville."
"And did M. d'Harville make you no voluntary confession?"
Not any. When I inquired the cause of his continual fits of melancholy, he would answer,
'Pray do not heed it; but I am always most sad when most happy.'"
These words, pronounced in the kindest and most touching manner, reassured me a little. And how, indeed, was it possible, when his voice would quiver with emotion, and his eyes fill with tears, to manifest any further suspicion by repeating my questions as to the past, when it was with the future only I had any business? The persons appointed to witness the contract on the part of M. d'Harville, M. de Lucenay, and M. de Saint Remy, arrived at Aubiers some days previous to the marriage. My nearest relations alone were invited. Immediately after the conclusion of the ceremony, we were to depart for Paris; and it is true I felt for M. d'Harville none of that love with which a young wife ought to regard the man she vows her future to, but I admired and respected his character and disposition, and, but for the disastrous events which followed this fatal union, a more tender feeling could doubtless soon have attached me to him. Well, we were married." At these words Madame d'Harville turned rather pale, and her resolution appeared to forsake her. After a pause, she resumed: "Immediately after the ceremony, my father embraced me tenderly, as did Madame Roland also. Before so many persons, I could not avoid the display of this fresh exhibition of hypocrisy. With her dry and white hand she squeezed mine so hard as to pain me, and said in a whisper, and in a tone as gentle as it was perfidious, these words, which I can never forget: 'Think of me sometimes in the midst of your bliss, for it was I who arranged your marriage.' Alas, I was far from comprehending at that moment the full force of those words. Our marriage took place at 11 o'clock, and we immediately entered our carriage, followed by my waiting woman and the old valet de chambre of M. d'Harville's, and we travelled so rapidly that we reached Paris before 10 o'clock in the evening. I should have been surprised at the silence and melancholy of M. d'Harville, had I not known that he had what he termed his happy sadness. I was myself painfully disturbed. I was returning to Paris for the first time since my mother's death. I arrived there alone with my husband, whom I had hardly known more than 6 weeks, and who, up to the evening before, had not addressed a word to me but what was marked by respectful formality. Men, however well bred, do not think sufficiently of the fear which the sudden change in their tone and manners occasions to a young female as soon as she belongs to them. They do not reflect that the youthful maiden cannot in a few hours forget all her timidity and virgin scruples.
Nothing is to me more barbarous than this system of carrying off a young female as soon as the wedding ceremony is over, a ceremony which ought to consecrate the right and duty to employ still more every tenderness of love and effort to render mutual affection still stronger and more endearing.
You will imagine, monseigneur, the indefinable alarm with which I found myself in Paris, in the city in which my mother had died hardly a year before. We reached the Hôtel d'Harville. The emotion of the young lady redoubled, her cheeks were flushed with scarlet, and she added, in a voice scarcely intelligible: "You must know all; if not, I shall appear too contemptible in your eyes. Well, then," she resumed, with desperate resolution, "I was led to my apartment and left there alone. After an hour M. d'Harville joined me there. I was weeping bitterly. My husband came towards me, and was about to take my arm, when he fell at my feet in agony. He could not hear my voice, his countenance was spasmodic with fearful convulsions, his eyes rolled in their orbits with a rapidity that appalled me, his contorted mouth was filled with blood and foam, and his hand grasped me with inconceivable force. I made a desperate effort, and his stiffened fingers at length unclasped from my wrist, and I fainted at the moment when M. d'Harville was struggling in the paroxysm of this horrible attack. This was my wedding night, my lord. This was the vengeance of Madame Roland."
"Unhappy woman!" said Rodolph, overwhelmed. "I understand, an epileptic. Ah, 'tis horrible!"
"And that is not all," added Clémence, in a voice almost choked by emotion. "My child, my angel girl, she has inherited this frightful malady."
"Your daughter, she what? Her paleness, her weakness "
"Is, I dread to believe, hereditary, and the physicians think, therefore, that it is incurable."
CHAPTER XII.
By Céline Major.